He has written 7 books, 6 on the subject of education. We were laughing at Oliver North's honorary doctorate he was awarded today, Doctor of Humanities at Liberty University. And he told us that Dr. Blumenfeld said, well, I can go that one. I am an honorary doctorate of laws from the Bob Jones University. And that occurred in May of 1986, which he is very proud of, and we wanted you to know. His numerous articles have appeared in New York Times, New York Herald Tribune, Commentary, American Opinion, Ideas, Esquire, Reason, Inquiry, American Education, Education Digest, American Legion Magazine, Conservative Digest, the list goes on and on. I know you have read a lot of his articles, and many of you have heard him speak in the past. He's noticed several familiar faces or hosts and hostesses in the audience that he has seen in his travels around the country. So let me not take any time from what he has to say to us and introduce to you Dr. Blumenfeld.
Thank you, Mrs. Blankenship, very much for that kind introduction. It certainly is a great pleasure to be with you here in Coeur d'Alene, one of those beautiful spots in America. And I have friends here. I've been here before, so it's not entirely new territory, but it's always a delight to visit the Inland Empire and to be reminded of how absolutely beautiful it is here. I spent the weekend in Milwaukee, where I spoke at a CWA convention there, and they think that Wisconsin is beautiful. You ought to come out here. It is beautiful. Okay. But anyway, the subject tonight, of course, is the politicizing of American education. And really, it all began way back, almost 100 years ago. Not as a means of training children or educating, but as a means of changing American society. That is changing America from a capitalist, individualistic, religious nation into a socialist, collectivist, atheist nation. That whole program began way back in the 1890s. And the man who was probably more responsible for that shift, that is, changing the entire function of education from an academic role to a social role, was John Dewey. I'm sure you're all familiar with John Dewey. And Dewey wrote a very interesting, Dewey was greatly influenced, he and his colleagues, as a matter of fact, were greatly influenced by a book that was written in 1888 by Edward Bellamy, entitled Looking Backward. Now, in that book, Bellamy projected a utopian socialist America in the year 2000. It was a kind of fantasy, the book. And that was the model that Dewey and his colleagues used when they thought of this socialistic America that they wanted. So they had a picture, an image of the future they wanted, this socialist future, and it was in Bellamy's book. That book now is 100 years old. This is the 100th anniversary of the publication of Looking Backward. And of course, if you read that book today, you can see how foolish their notions, or Bellamy's notions, were. But nevertheless, that book had a tremendous impact on the educators at that time. You see, Bellamy, as well as Dewey and his colleagues, were members of the Protestant academic elite who no longer believed in the religion of their fathers. They rejected the Bible, they rejected Christianity, and now they put their faith in science evolution and psychology. These were the great things of that time. Science, of course, permitted them to know everything they wanted to know about the material world, and after all, that's all there was, just the material world. They did not believe in the existence of any other world. Evolution explained the origin of man. You didn't need Genesis, you didn't need the Bible. The Garden of Eden was a myth. And after all, man was just an animal and arose out of the primordial ooze with the rest of the creatures. So that explained where man came from. And of course, psychology now permitted these gentlemen to use science as a means of understanding human nature and also as a means of controlling human behavior. So they had it all, you see. They had everything they needed. They said, we don't need religion. Now, why did they become socialists? Well, if you read Bellamy, you will find, and if you read Dewey and the others, you'll find that the reason why they turned to socialism as the cure-all was because when you reject the Bible, when you reject religion, you reject the Bible's explanation for the origin of evil. And they had to deal with the problem of evil. You can't get a utopia without getting rid of evil, can you? I mean, that's what utopia is, the absence of evil. Well, now, how are you going to get rid of evil? First of all, you've got to know, where does evil come from? Well, the Bible tells us that evil is the result of man's sinful nature, his fallen nature. The Catholics call it original sin. The Calvinists call it innate depravity. That's the same thing. In other words, we were born with this sinful nature, which is the cause of our problem, the problem of evil. Calvin believed, as a matter of fact, in total depravity. He believed that when man rejects God and frees himself from the constraints that God has put on his behavior, he is capable of any depravity he can possibly think of. And I think we've seen that confirmed in the 20th century. If there's any kind of depravity that man can imagine, he will act it out. There's no doubt about that. But in those days, remember, you see, in the 1890s, that was both before World War I, before Hitler, before communism, before the Russian Revolution, and so they had this optimistic view of the perfectibility of human nature, you see. Now, incidentally, the Bible poses the problem of evil. It says, man, you have this evil nature, but it also provides a solution. It says, yes, you do have this terrible, evil, sinful nature, but you can still lead a happy, productive, and long life provided you live within the constraints outlined by God in the Scripture. If you live within those constraints, you can have a long, happy, and prosperous and productive life. And if you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, your sins will be forgiven, and you will be saved, and you will have eternal life after death. Well, my heavens is a fantastic solution to a horrible problem. So the Bible has it. It gives us the cause of evil and provides a solution. But now if you reject all of that, and John Dewey did, and his colleagues, they rejected all of that as being mythology, fairy tale. They said there is no such thing as sin. Man is tabula rasa, you know, he comes into the world with no particular nature. He's not sinful by nature, you see. And so they said, but they had to explain what causes evil. Well, their explanation was that evil is caused by the obvious: ignorance, poverty, and social injustice. Those are the causes of evil, the good old liberal causes of evil. You've heard them over and over again, that poverty is the cause of all our problems, ignorance is the cause of all our problems, social injustice. And so they said, and then they asked themselves, well, what causes social injustice? Well, it was obvious. It's this horrible capitalist system. That's the cause of social injustice, you see. Free enterprise, private property, it makes people selfish. Individualism is the cause of social injustice. And of course, religion. This horrible religion which tells people that they are sinful by nature. Because if you tell people they're sinful by nature, what are they going to do? Well, you know, the power of suggestion. They're going to go out and sin. So they said, if we want to get rid of evil, if we want to get rid of social injustice, we've got to get rid of capitalism, individualism, and religion, and replace them with socialism, collectivism, and atheism or humanism, and then we will have utopia. We'll have a perfect society, we'll have a crimeless society, and it'll be wonderful. And so now these men embarked on a messianic mission to change America from a capitalist, individualistic, believing nation into a socialist, collectivist, atheist nation. Incidentally, why don't we put their theory to the test that evil is caused by ignorance, poverty, and social injustice. Let's see how it works. Let's take a particularly evil human being. For example, the late Dr. Joseph Mengele, the man who was responsible for all those atrocities in the concentration camps where he experimented on live human beings, did all sorts of horrible things, one of the most evil men of all time. And, well, was he ignorant? No, he had the best university education that Germany could provide. Became a medical doctor. Well, was he a victim of poverty? No, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Came from a family of industrialists. Well, was he a victim of social injustice? No, he belonged to the elite in Germany. Never suffered a day of persecution in his life. So apparently, the Dewey theory doesn't quite work out. The progressive theory of evil doesn't quite work out. The only way you can explain that Joseph Mengele is to understand his basic sinful nature, his depravity, his innate depravity, and his throwing off of all of the restraints against that depravity, and acting out his depraved nature. Well, in any case, these men embarked on this messianic mission to change America. Now, they realized that they couldn't change the adults. American adults were not about to give up their private property, their free enterprise, their religions, their belief in God, or their individualism. So these men thought, well, if they want to bring about socialism, they would have to work through education. The revolution would have to take place through education. In other words, it had to educate children in such a manner so that the children, when they became adults, they would be the ones who would get rid of capitalism, individualism, and religion, and create this new socialist utopia. Now, you might ask, why did these men embark on this messianic mission? Well, you see something very interesting about these men. They all came from good Christian families. John Dewey taught Sunday school as a young man in Vermont. He came from a Congregationalist family. Edward L. Thorndike's father was a Methodist minister. Others among them had fathers who were ministers and missionaries. So they knew their Bible very well. They knew Christianity very well. And they were determined to prove that they were right, because if they were wrong, they knew where they'd be going, right? So they had to prove that they were right. And how could they prove that they were right? By creating this socialist utopia and saying, see, we told you so. We told you that human beings are perfectible. We told you we can create a crimeless society, a society virtually devoid of evil, simply by putting our ideas into action, into practice. And so they were determined to prove that they were right. And of course, they decided to use the schools as the means to do this. Now, John Dewey, who was really the brains behind this, very intelligent man, did a very profound analysis of the capitalist individualistic system. And he came to the conclusion that the real culprit behind the capitalist individualistic religious system was high literacy. This stress of language. You see, because he had been brought up in a Congregationalist tradition, and the Congregationalists, when they settled Boston back in the 1600s, what was the first thing they did when they created their settlement? They created Harvard University. And what did they teach at Harvard University? Latin, Greek, Hebrew, English. Tremendous stress on the learning of language, not only because these languages were the original languages of the Bible and of theological literature, but because it was a language that gave man his culture, his civilization. There they were in the middle of the wilderness studying Latin, Greek, and Hebrew and English. So it was something that was ingrained in the Puritans, and the importance of the study of language, because you had to know your Bible. The Protestant community, the Puritan community was biblically based, and so everybody had to read, everybody had to be able to read the Bible. So it was a highly literate community, a highly literate civilization. And John Dewey, in analyzing this, said if we want to create a new socialist system, if we want to create young individuals who will be easily moved into a socialist system, we have got to de-emphasize this business of teaching literacy. We've got to de-emphasize the teaching of language and of the intellectual skills and the academic skills, and we've got to now put a new emphasis. We've got to put the emphasis on the development of the social skills. Group activities, group interaction, group thinking, group decision-making. We've got to put the emphasis on behavior, on emotions, on values. Today they call that the affective domain. If you read any curriculum guide, you will read a lot about the affective domain. The affective domain are all of those subjects that are sort of, very vague, but they're all dealing with values and sexuality and delving into the emotions of the kids. They want to find out what your mother thinks, what your father thinks, and how you like your friends and all of that. That's the affective domain, the values clarification, all of that. So he said that's what we've got to do. We've got to put the emphasis there. Now, Dewey wrote an interesting article in which he was already very much into this in the 1890s. He wrote an interesting article in, let's see, it was in 1898, an essay. At that time he was at the University of Chicago. He had created his laboratory school at the University of Chicago to put his ideas to the test so that he could come up with this new curriculum for the schools, at the end of which I think he devoted 6 years to the experiments, and he put all of his findings in a little book entitled School and Society. But in 1898, he wrote an article that more or less described what had to be done. And let me just quote from it, because I think you'll find it quite interesting. The title of the article was called The Primary Education Fetish. And this is what he said. He said, "There is a false educational god whose idolaters are legion and whose cult influences the entire educational system. This is language study, the study not of foreign language but of English, not in higher but in primary education. It is almost an unquestioned assumption of educational theory and practice, both that the first 3 years of a child's school life shall be mainly taken up with learning to read and write his own language. If we add to this the learning of a certain amount of numerical combinations, we have the pivot about which primary education swings. It does not follow, however, that because this course was once wise, it is so any longer. The present has its claims. It is in education, if anywhere, that the claims of the present should be controlling. My proposition is that conditions, social, industrial, and intellectual, have undergone such a radical change that the time has come for a thoroughgoing examination of the emphasis put upon linguistic work in elementary instruction. The plea for the predominance of learning to read in early school life because of the great importance attaching to literature, seems to me a perversion. You see, it's a perversion if you're going to stress the teaching of reading. And then he said, every respectable authority insists that the period of childhood lying between the years of 4 and 8 or 9 is the plastic period in sense and emotional life. What are we doing to shape these capacities? What are we doing to feed this hunger? If one compared the powers and needs of the child in these directions with what is actually supplied in the regimen of the 3 R's, the contrast is pitiful and tragic. No one can clearly set before himself the vivacity and persistency of the child's motor instincts at this period and then call to mind the continued grind of reading and writing without feeling that the justification of our present curriculum is psychologically impossible. It is simply superstition. It is a remnant of an outgrown period of history, unquote. There it is. 1898, reading and writing, the emphasis is based on superstition. It's outmoded. Incidentally, Dewey was quite wrong. He said, well, it's so obvious that it's the child's motor instincts at this period that are so important, you know. And so why stress reading and writing at this period? But he forgot one little thing. He forgot that children have tremendous language learning energy at that age. Their brains are working twice as much as an adult brain at that time in life. As a matter of fact, every child teaches himself to speak his own language. Isn't that amazing? So that by the time a child is ready to go to school, he has mastered a speaking vocabulary between 5,000 and 35,000 words. Isn't that an amazing achievement? So what if he likes to jump around and tumble? Don't you think his brain's pretty unique? Isn't that an incredible achievement that these little kids teach themselves to speak their own language all by themselves without the help of Sesame Street? Without the help of clowns jumping out of garbage cans? Isn't that amazing? They teach themselves. You see, and that's why language learning is so important in those early years, because you've got this tremendous language learning energy. But you see, Dewey understood what was behind the development of our civilization. It was the emphasis on language learning, but he said, well, that's all superstition. We've got to change all that. And then he said this. He was a master strategist, this man. He said, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. You see, he knew that parents wouldn't like this change of emphasis. So he said, we've got to work gradually. We don't want to, alarm the people. It's the old, the frog in the hot water technique. If you throw a frog in boiling water, it'll jump out. But if you want to cook him, you put him first in cool water, and then it gets a little warmer and a little warmer, and he becomes used to it, and then he becomes drowsy and falls asleep, and then you can cook him. Water feels pretty hot these days, doesn't it? We've been in it for quite some time. But we're just a little too tired to jump out. We're ready to fall asleep, actually. Well, he goes on, he says, change must come gradually. What is needed in the first place is that there should be a full and frank statement of conviction with regard to the matter from physiologists and psychologists and from those school administrators who are conscious of the evils of the present regime. Now, it's interesting, he says that we must get a full and frank statement of conviction from psychologists, because then the psychologists got to work and began writing all of these books on how awful it is to teach children to read by the ABC method. As a matter of fact, the first such book was published in 1908, and it was entitled The Psychology and Pedagogy of Reading, and it was written by Edmund Burke Huey, who was a member of that group, and who pooh-poohed the teaching of reading by the alphabetic phonics method, and said, we've got to go to this new look-say, whole word method and teach children to read English as if we're Chinese. that's what he says they've got to do. He was sentenced in 1898. 10 years later, there was a book available on the subject. Then he says, wherever movements looking to a solution of the problem are intelligently undertaken, they should receive encouragement, moral and financial, from the intellectual leaders of the community, also including the foundations, because it was many of these foundations that put money into these newfangled progressive ideas. There are already in existence a considerable number of educational experimental stations which represent the outposts of educational progress. If these schools can be adequately supported for a number of years, they will perform a great vicarious service. And the foundations were recruited to support all these experimental stations, these outposts of educational progress. After such schools have worked out carefully and definitely the subject matter of a new curriculum, finding the right place for language studies and placing them in their right perspective, which means at the bottom of a barrel, the problem of the more general educational reform will be immensely simplified and facilitated. And so there he really set the stage for all of this. He was the master strategist of this entire new change in the curriculum. Now, how are they going to teach reading and lower the literacy level of the American people? How are they going to dumb down the people so that they could be led into this socialist utopia? Well, they remember these men were the world's leading behavioral psychologists, the world's leading, America's leading educators, and they said to themselves, Eureka, we've got it. We will teach children to read English as if it were Chinese. That'll do the trick. And so they dug out an old look-say method of teaching that was invented by Thomas H. Gallaudet, the teacher of the deaf and dumb in the 1800s, who had invented a method, he invented a method of teaching deaf people to read by a picture and a word. You see, the deaf cannot hear sounds, so they can't learn the sounds of the letters. So if you have a picture of a cat and the word cat, the deaf can learn some words that way. And Gallaudet thought that he could, that this method could be adapted for use by normal children. And so he created the first look-say primer in the United States called the Mother's Primer. It was published, I believe, in 1826 or thereabouts. And he tried to get it adopted by some schools, and in 1837 the Boston Primary School Committee adopted it for use in the Boston primary schools. Well, they used it in the Boston schools for about 8 years, and it proved to be so disastrous. It caused such problems that they got rid of it and went back to the alphabetic phonics method of teaching. In fact, in my book, The New Illiterates, I quote from the critique that was written about that method, written by the Boston schoolmasters at that time, who were absolutely appalled by this way of teaching reading. And in my book, I reproduce in its complete form, in toto, the first critique ever made of the look-say method, written in around 1848 or so. So you see, we knew the method didn't work in 1848. Well, now the professors took this methodology, the progressives, and they decided to add to it the knowledge that they had acquired in their laboratories in training animals. You see, now, all of these men were behavioral psychologists. They believed in evolution, and they believed that children were animals and could be taught like animals. And they did all of their experiments with animals. For example, Edward L. Thorndike, who was the leader of this educational psychology movement at Columbia University, a teacher's college, he did all of his experiments with chickens. He thought that he could learn a lot about how children learn by studying chickens. This was around in the 1890s, at about the same time that Dewey was doing his work. Pavlov, we know, in Russia, even before the Russian Revolution, was experimenting with dogs. You've heard of the Pavlov dog? And Pavlov, who was incidentally educated at the same German universities that many of the American psychologists were educated at, Leipzig under Wilhelm Wundt and other German professors. Pavlov did his experiment with dogs, as I mentioned, and developed the most sophisticated techniques of conditioning through these experiments with dogs. John B. Watson, under John Dewey at the University of Chicago, and Watson is known as the father of behaviorism, he did his experiments with rats. B.F. Skinner, a disciple of Watson, has continued to experiment with rats. You see, B.F. Skinner believes that there's not much of a difference between a human being and a rat. Now, there may not be much of a difference between B.F. Skinner and a rat. But there is a considerable difference as far as I'm concerned. But these men then applied this methodology, and they created a new way of teaching reading that would completely change American education and would lower the literacy level of the American people. Now, the progressives, of course, took more and more power because they created the graduate schools of education. They created the graduate schools of psychology. They put all of their graduates in their strategic places. Their superintendents became superintendents of large districts, school districts. Their graduates became professors in different graduate schools across the country, different teachers' colleges. And it took time before all of this, they were able to have their network so complete across the country that by 1930, they were ready to put this new method of teaching virtually in all the schools of America, because by 1930, the Dick and Jane books were ready, and the Macmillan Readers were ready. The Dick and Jane books were created by William Scott Gray, who was a disciple of Charles Judd, Professor Charles Judd at the University of Chicago. And Judd had gotten his psychology education at Leipzig under Wilhelm Wundt. And the Macmillan Readers were written by Arthur Gates, were conceived or edited by Arthur Gates, who became Thorndike's disciple. Now it's interesting, when Arthur Gates, who created the Macmillan Readers, was given a very important post at Teachers College, Columbia, by his mentor, Edward L. Thorndike. That is practically to be Thorndike's successor. He said to Thorndike, he said, Dr. Thorndike, I've never taught a single child how to read. And Thorndike replied, neither have I. And they were the ones who decided how to teach reading in America. Neither had ever taught a single child to read. But you see. So the books were ready about 1930, but in 1917, the progressives took control of the NEA, which is very important from a political point of view. Now, the NEA before 1917 was a rather small organization. It was not a large membership organization. It was sort of a discussion club for the academic elite. They had their yearly conventions. They had lots of interesting discussions and lectures given, and they had a lot of people came to the convention simply because all the publishers had exhibits there. In those days, publishers were able to be members of the NEA. Anyone interested in education at that time could be a member of the NEA, you see. But the progressives realized that if they were going to implement this foolishness, this ridiculous new curriculum in the schools of America, they would need the cooperation of the teachers. And so they decided to take over the NEA, which very easy to take over. There were about 5 people running the whole thing, all of whom believed in the progressive philosophy. And so they changed the NEA into a large teacher membership organization and began to produce a monthly magazine, etc., so that they could influence the teachers of America. So there they were, and of course they also began their big program to get federal aid for education. As soon as the progressives took over the NEA, their big drive now was to get the federal government to fund public education. Incidentally, the NEA was founded in 1857, and at that very first founding meeting, they called for the creation of a Department of Education with a cabinet level secretary. You see, because the NEA was very much interested in creating a national education system, much like the systems that the Europeans had. See, in Europe, you had a highly centralized education system run by the state, managed by a minister of education. They wanted the same thing in America, but they realized we've got all these different states that control their state education departments, and so they said, well, we'll create a national education association that will bring all of the educators together so that even though the states all have their own departments of education, we will all think alike. We'll be able to travel all over the country, and it won't make any difference whether you come from New York or South Carolina or Texas or Idaho. You'll be cut from the same cloth. And of course we know that's true today. You have these wandering superintendents who go from city to city, you know, and they're all cut from the same cloth. If you have ever found any one of these superintendents different from any other one, you know. Incidentally, all during the 30s, tremendous pressure was put on the superintendents to believe in socialism. I mean, if you read the speeches that were given at the conference, at the conventions of superintendents, they were all socialistically oriented. They wanted the superintendents to believe in socialism. Now, when the Look-Say books were ready in 1930 to be put in the schools, all of their men were in place. And it worked like a clock. The NEA magazine, NEA journal, published article after article about how wonderful these new teaching techniques were. Elevated men like Arthur Gates and William Scott Gray to the heights of academia. And very soon the books were in the school. There was only one problem, though. America was in the middle of a depression, and not too many school districts had the money to buy the new books. I remember when I was in the first grade in 1931 in New York City, we were still using the old phonics books, so I learned how to read. So the Depression saved my literacy. And it wasn't until later years when the phonics books were all worn out and the schools had to buy new books that they had to buy the Look-Say textbooks because no other books were being published. You see, the publishers were in cahoots with the educators because the educators decided what was going to be used in the schools, and the publishers are very obliging. They'll publish anything you want, provided you'll buy it from them. So that's how they were able to swing that, you see. But the Depression sort of slowed things down. Another interesting thing about the Depression was that it put tremendous pressure on the superintendents to obey their mentors, to obey the professors who had gotten their jobs. You remember how hard it was to get a job during the Depression? If you were the superintendent of a school district, that was a pretty good job. And if your professor wanted you to put Dick and Jane in your school district, if you didn't hop to, you would have been fired. As a matter of fact, George Strayer, who was one of the leading professors involved in this at Teachers College of Columbia, he said that should any superintendent not do what you want him to do, give him the axe. They created what I call the educational mafia. in the 20s and 30s, in which the entire educational system was run by these professors out of the major graduate schools of education. And you could no more do anything against these professors if you wanted to keep your job. And so they had created quite a system. And so these books were put in the schools, and no sooner were the books in the schools than America began to have a reading problem. Now it's interesting that, of course, parents weren't told that the schools were about to change the way children are taught to read. And this was pulled on them quite without their knowledge. And the educators, while it was possible in those days to know what they were doing, because after all, if you read the articles that Dewey wrote, and etc., you would know what he was doing. But the public in general was pretty ignorant about how this progressive education worked. You know, they generally many people went along with it because it said progressive. If it's progressive, it has to be good, right? And so a lot of people went along with this, not really knowing what was behind all of this. And when this new method of teaching came in, of course, you had all kinds of people defending it and the upper echelons of the education establishment, telling how wonderful this new look-say method is. But there was one man who knew that this method would destroy literacy and would harm many kids. This man was Dr. Samuel T. Orton, a neuropathologist at Iowa State University. Now, during the 20s, Dr. Orton was seeing a lot of youngsters in his clinic with reading problems. And in diagnosing their problems, he came to the conclusion that they were being caused by this new teaching method, which I guess was being used in Iowa on an experimental basis. Because before Dick and Jane and the Macmillan readers were put into schools, a lot of small schools were using the look-say method on an experimental basis. And here in Iowa, they were using it. And so he became rather alarmed. He said, gee, I better warn these professors. And he knew that they were about to put these books in all the schools. He said, I better warn them that what they're about to do is going to cause terrible problems. And so he wrote an article that appeared in the February 1929 issue of the Journal of Educational Psychology. The title of the article was The Sight Reading Method of Teaching Reading as a Source of Reading Disability. And this is what he said. Now, of course, he tried to be as diplomatic as possible because he was about to criticize the country's leading educators, the John Deweys of America, the country's leading behavioral psychologists. So he tried to be as diplomatic as possible. But this is what he said. He said, I wish to emphasize at the beginning that the strictures which I have to offer here do not apply to the use of the sight method of teaching reading as a whole, but only to its effects on a restricted group of children for whom, as I think we can show, this technique is not only not adapted, but often proves an actual obstacle to reading progress. And moreover, I believe that this group is one of considerable size. Today we know that it's 1/3 of the total student population, so it's a lot of kids. And because here, faulty teaching methods may not only prevent the acquisition of academic education by children of average capacity, but may also give rise to far-reaching damage to their emotional life. Well, that's very plain. He said it in 1929. Now, perhaps you might think the professors didn't read the article. They had to. It was published in their own journal. There was only one journal of educational psychology, and it was actually edited by the very professors who were about to put this new method in the schools. Now, then you might say, well, maybe Dr. Orton wasn't very important. Well, he was already a world's leading authority on the brain, and then he went on to become the world's leading authority on dyslexia. As a matter of fact, after the books were put in the schools and we began to have all of this reading disability, he and Gillingham created the most effective remedial program, Anna Gillingham, called the Orton-Gillingham method of teaching. As a matter of fact, it was Dr. Orton who then trained a bunch of doctors who then went back to their hospitals in various parts of the country and created their reading clinics. We had one in Massachusetts General Hospital, and it was manned by a physician who was trained by Dr. Orton. But obviously the professors had no intention of following what Orton recommended, and they went on and, as I said, put these books in the schools, and no sooner were they in the schools than America began to have a reading problem. And as a matter of fact, the problem was so bad that by 1944, dyslexia had become a household word. By 1944 already. As a matter of fact, in April of that year, Life magazine published a lead article on dyslexia, in which they stated, millions of children in the U.S. suffer from dyslexia, which is the medical term for reading difficulties. It is responsible for about 70% of the school failures in the 6 to 12-year-old age group, and handicaps about 15% of all grade school children. Dyslexia may stem from a variety of physical ailments or combination of them. You see, the editors of Life obviously went to the professors and asked them, gee guys, what's causing all of this dyslexia? And here were their replies: glandular imbalance, heart disease, eye or ear trouble, or from a deep-seated psychological disturbance that blocks a child's ability to learn. See, they knew that something was blocking the child's ability to learn, so they attributed it to a deep-seated psychological disturbance. The article then described the treatment given a young girl afflicted with dyslexia. Thyroid treatments, removal of tonsils and adenoids, exercises to strengthen her eye muscles. Nowhere did they recommend teaching her the alphabet. And you can imagine the professors laughing all the way to the bank, carrying their satchels of royalty money because they were making lots of money. You can imagine how much money William Scott Gray and colleagues made from the Dick and Jane readers. The Dick and Jane books sold by the millions. And incidentally, they were expensive for the schools because prior to this look-say method, it was very inexpensive to teach a child to read by the alphabetic phonics method. I mean, have you seen the New England primers? Have you ever seen a New England primer? You know how small they are? You can practically put it in your pocket. That's what was used to teach children to read in those days. Today, a basal reading program, a look-say basal reading program, you need 4 feet of shelf space to put it on. And the first book, take for example the Houghton Mifflin reading program. Their first pre-primer runs to about 150 pages, most of which is just lots of pictures. It's just garbage, absolute utter garbage. Lots of pictures. One little story, the text of which goes something like, I go, 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 go. I go, 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 I go, 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 go. The teacher's manual for that garbage. You realize the teacher needs a manual to teach I go? The teacher's manual is 500 pages long. 500 pages. Check it out. Check it out at your local school book depository. So, the professors had taken something that had been once very simple, very inexpensive, and had turned it into the most complex, most expensive part of elementary education, you see. So they were making lots of money. And, you know, there they were ruining the literacy of a nation, getting rich in the process, and having a wonderful time doing it. Until 1955, when Dr. Rudolph Flesch blew the whistle. Remember Dr. Flesch? He wrote a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. And in that book he told the American people, hey guys, there's nothing wrong with your kids. They don't have glandular imbalance, heart disease. The reason reason why they're not learning to read is because of this stupid, asinine, ridiculous method of teaching. And then he pointed an accusing finger at the professors whose names he named in his book. It's a very useful book. He names all of the professors who are writing these horrible books. And he said, look, you dummies, don't you know that phonics works better than looks say? Well, of course they knew that. He wasn't telling them anything they didn't know. But they were absolutely furious with this man because he was holding them up to public ridicule. He made them appear stupid in public because why would anybody teach children to read by this stupid method? By this teaching children to read English as if it were Chinese. You know, would have to be stupidity. They just assumed these men were stupid. But of course we know they were anything but stupid. There was method in their madness. And so they said, we'll fix this man's wagon. We'll turn the entire teaching profession against Rudolf Flesch. And that's exactly what they did through their lectures and their critiques and their articles. They told the teachers of America, don't read this man's book. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's maligning education, public education. He's misrepresenting us. He's a charlatan. He's trying to destroy American education. He's evil incarnate. As a matter of fact, when Time magazine summed up the teacher reaction to Rudolf Flesch, the title of the article for that year, 1955, the title of the article was "The Devil in the Flesh," to show you the view the teachers had of the man who was trying to help them teach reading. And then the professors did something very clever. They created the International Reading Association, which has become the world's largest professional organization for the teachers of reading. And it is that organization today, the International Reading Association, which incidentally is going to have its convention in Toronto, I believe, this month. It's that association which keeps America's teachers in line and forces them to teach by this ridiculous method, which is producing functional illiteracy on a scale that's undreamed of, that is destroying the literacy of the nation, and there's no way that you can stop these people. No way that you could stop these people. They're such a power now that, incidentally, when Rudolf Flesch's first book came out in 1955, you know, they wrote all sorts of articles, they spoke against it, there was a tremendous controversy in the country. When Rudolf Flesch wrote a new book in 1981 entitled Why Johnny Still Can't Read, in which he said, you dummies, you didn't listen to me in 1955 and now you have a catastrophe on your hands. Well, in 1981, when his new book came out, they didn't even pay it 2 cents. They said, we don't even have to bother to criticize this man. Nobody believes him anyway. We're in total, complete power. We have total and complete control. So you barely heard a word from the educators. They just went on their merry way to keep doing what they've been doing all these years and are doing at this very moment. And to prove to you that their method is based on animal training techniques, let me read to you a description of the look-say method given by Professor Walter Dearborn of Harvard University in 1940. Now, Dr. Dearborn got his PhD at Teachers College from Thorndike. And this is what he wrote in 1940 from his high state at Harvard University. The principle which we have used to explain the acquisition of a sight vocabulary. And incidentally, let me explain what a sight vocabulary is before I do that so you understand what this means. You see, to teach a child to read by the alphabetic phonics method, you go through three steps. First, you teach a child to recognize the letters of the alphabet. Then you teach the child the sounds that the letters stand for, because in case you don't know, the letters of the alphabet stand for the sounds of the language. You know, they stand for the irreducible sounds. So the second step is to drill the child that the sounds of the letters stand for. And of course, this was done in the old days, for hundreds and hundreds of years, in a very simple mechanical way. They would teach the child, for example, that the letter B stood for the consonant sound B, and the letter M stood for the consonant sound M. Then they would join the consonants with the vowels, and they would drill the child in the consonant-vowel combinations in column forms, such as baby, bi, bo, bu, may, me, my, mo, mu, ba, 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 ma, ma, me, ma, ma. Very simple, very mechanical, very easy. Anybody can do it. You don't have to be a genius. That's why everybody learned to read in those days. The purpose of the drill was to make sure that the child developed an automatic association between letter and sound, because that's the heart of learning an alphabetic writing system. An automatic association between letter and sound. You see the letters, you hear the sounds. Just as when you read music, you see the notes on the page, you hear the music. An alphabetic writing system is a sound symbol system. Well, when the child does that, then he goes to step 3, where he learns words and sentences, reads sentences and little stories. Now, in this sight method, invented by John Dewey and his friends, they teach step 1 generally. They'll teach the alphabet. Not always, usually. But then they skip step 2 and go directly to step 3, and they teach the child a sight vocabulary. Now, a sight vocabulary, by definition, is teaching children to read whole words without their knowing that the letters stand for anything. As far as they're concerned, the letters are totally arbitrary squiggles with no meaning whatever, arranged in a totally haphazard fashion, you see. So now, that is what a sight vocabulary is. Now, how does a child learn a sight vocabulary? Well, let's take, for example, the word horse. The child is introduced to the word horse. He doesn't know that the letters stand for anything, so the teacher puts a little frame around the word horse and says, see the little horse? He's got to see a picture. You see, because ideographs are pictures, little pictures, none of which look like the things they represent. So H-O-R-S-E does not look like a horse. So how does a child see a horse in that? You know how? Any way he can. So then the teacher realized that it's not enough to just put a frame around the word. So she says, okay, we'll give you lots of picture clues. When the word horse is introduced, there are lots of pictures of horses, so the child guesses that the word must be horse. And then they also give the child context clues. They'll use, for example, because they can't always have pictures of horses every time they use the word horse, so they use the word in context so that the child will guess what it says. For example, the man put the saddle on, and the child will guess, well, it could be a camel, it could be a donkey, but it's probably a horse. And then they also teach the child phonetic clues. See, all of these teachers in America who teach the look-say method, they'll tell you, oh, we teach phonics. We teach phonics. But they don't. They teach phonetic clues. What are phonetic clues? They will teach the child that if the word begins with H, it couldn't possibly be bologna or barbecue. It can be hotel, house, hovel, hearse, or horse. So they reduce the ridiculousness of the guesses. As a matter of fact, Professor Kenneth Goodman, the leading professor of reading in the United States, calls reading a psycholinguistic guessing game. Because that's what the kids are doing, they're guessing all the time. So that's what a sight vocabulary is, and that's how they teach children to read. And naturally, if you're going to be taught to read that way, you're not going to learn to read very well or very accurately. But Dr. Dearborn says, the principle which we have used to explain the acquisition of a sight vocabulary is, of course, the one suggested by Pavlov's well-known experiments on the conditioned response. This is as it should be. The basic process involved in conditioning and in learning to read is the same. You see, that's why they'll teach go, 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 I go, 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 instead of teaching go, no, so, do, ho. You see, which phonetic in an alphabetic phonics way, you learn a whole lot of words with the O. But in this stupid method, this slow, ridiculous method, they just go, 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 go on. So he's saying the basis process involved in conditioning and in learning to read is the same. In other words, we teach children to read in America as if they were dogs. Now, I believe there is a bit of a difference between a child and a dog. After all, when a dog enters the first grade, what can a dog say? Arf, arf, right? And let us assume that our little canine friend is then socially promoted right through to the 12th grade, as so many youngsters are these days, reaches that momentous occasion at graduation, trots up to the podium to receive his diploma, holds out his paw, looks up into the eyes of the principal, and what can that poor little doggy say? Arf, arf. In 12 years, that poor little dog hasn't learned a single word. But a human child enters the first grade with a speaking vocabulary between 5,000 and 35,000 words. Isn't that amazing? Every child teaches himself to speak his own language, virtually from birth, so that by the time he's ready to go to school, he's mastered his auditory and verbal skills to such a high degree that he's got a speaking vocabulary of thousands and thousands of words. And he's done it all by himself. Isn't that amazing? You see, every child is a dynamo of language learning. Why? Because God made them that way. You see, God gave us the power of language. He did not give it to any of the other species. He didn't give it to the animals. And of course, this upsets the behavioral psychologists quite a bit. See, they've been trying to say, well, we're all a bunch of animals, and so they call human language, they poo-poo human language and say, oh, don't make such a fuss over human language. What else is it? It's just verbal behavior, that's all it is. It's just an evolutionary development from animal talk. It's a little more complicated way of saying bow wow, meow, chirp chirp. That's all it is. As a matter of fact, they're convinced that the reason why monkeys don't speak is because they've been culturally deprived. So they've actually experimented by having monkeys live among human families to see if they would learn to speak. But I'm afraid the poor little monkeys haven't done much better than our little canine friend in school. See, only human beings have the power of speech. Now, why? Well, you see, God created us in His image, and He wanted to have a means of communicating with us. And so He gave us the power of the Word, because what does it say in the Bible? It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So there's something very special about the Word, and He gave human beings the power of the Word. And incidentally, the alphabet was invented about 2,000 years B.C. Prior to that, man used an ideographic form of writing. You've seen Egyptian hieroglyphics. Modern Chinese is an ideographic writing system. They have 50,000 of those little squigglies, none of which look like anything they represent. They're little pictures of ideas. See, at the beginning, when all this began, they first used pictography. The cavemen drew little pictures on the walls of the caves. And you didn't have to go to school to learn to read those pictures. You know, a man looked like a man, an animal looked like an animal, a bow and arrow looked like a bow and arrow. But as civilization became more complex, the scribes had to begin drawing pictures of things that did not look like the things they represented. I mean, how do you know, it's easy enough to draw a picture of a man, but how do you draw a picture of an idea? How do you draw a picture of good and evil? You see. How do you draw a picture of system or method? How do you draw a picture of determination? How do you draw a picture of method? You can't, so what do? You draw a little picture and you say, this stands for method. It doesn't look like method, but it stands for method. And so they created thousands and thousands of little pictures, none of which look like anything that they represented. And so now some of you had to go to school and learn thousands and thousands of these little symbols. And then around 2,000 years B.C., somebody made a remarkable discovery. Somebody discovered that all of human language is composed of a small number of irreducible speech sounds. And so that individual said, instead of using this cumbersome system of of little squigglies and pictures, none of which look like anything they represent or require years and years to master, why don't I create a small set of symbols to stand for the irreducible speech sounds of the language, and then we will have a very simple way of transcribing the spoken word into written form, and an equally simple way of translating the written back into spoken form, and so the first alphabet was invented. Now, English, of course, how many irreducible speech sounds do you think there are in the English language? We have a vocabulary approaching 1 million words. How many irreducible speech sounds do you think there are in English? Does anybody want to volunteer? Anyone read my book? Want to volunteer? 44. Right, 44 sounds. Only 44 sounds in English. Isn't that wonderful? But you see, now you might ask, well, we have a 26-letter alphabet. How come? How did that happen? Well, what happened was when the Romans conquered the British Islands, they imposed the Latin alphabet on the people who lived there, and the people who lived there adapted the Latin alphabet to their needs. And so our alphabetic system is a little more complex than others because some of our letters stand for more than one sound, and some of our sounds are represented by more than one letter. But we've managed to produce the world's greatest literature with our English alphabetic system. Children have learned to read by it for centuries without any problems. And of course, something else of great importance occurred when the alphabet was invented. The scripture began to appear. You see, mankind had to wait until he had a precise, accurate means of transcribing the spoken word directly into written form before the Word of God could be put on paper. Precision and accuracy are the hallmarks of alphabetic writing. That's not so of ideographic writing. I'll give you an illustration. We use lots of ideographs today in America. You've seen them. International airports, little pictures on doors, you know. Now, you've seen the little sign, the circle with the cigarette and the slash through it, haven't you? Now, when you see that, what do you say? Oh, gee, I can't smoke. I may not light up. No smoking permitted. Nicht rauchen. Défense de fumer. No fumar. Thou shalt not smoke. But the sign that says no smoking, that's all it says. It represents two spoken words. No smoking. Doesn't say anything else. So that's the precision and accuracy of alphabetic writing as opposed to the inaccuracy of an ideograph. So that's why it's so important. That's what makes the crucial difference between our writing system and an ideographic one. If you teach children to read by this same method, you create inaccurate readers. I've trained many of these readers. I know how they read. They read along, but you find that they leave out words that are there. They put in words that aren't there. Oh, they're editing and rewriting as they go along, you see. Then they guess words that they, not quite sure of. And of course, then they do something very interesting. They truncate words. They'll see a word like telephone and they'll say phone. They'll see a word like newspaper and they'll say paper. It says newspaper, but they see paper. They don't see newspaper, they see paper. So they become very inaccurate readers. Now here is Dr. Pearson, Dearborn, telling us that we teach children to read English as if they were dogs. And as I explain, a human being comes to school, a child comes to school with this enormous language learning energy, which Dewey discounted. He was interested in their motor, their little motorboats. That's what he was interested in. Go, go, go. That's where they use, you've heard of go, go, that's where they get it from. But now here's our little Johnny. He's ready to go to school. This is the way they teach reading these days. And he's taught himself to speak his own language. Very intelligent. You know how these kids feel at that age. They feel very intelligent. You know why? They are intelligent. When a 5-year-old teaches himself to speak his own language, he feels very intelligent. So here's this youngster, he ends his school, and he's ready to learn to read. He says, gee, I taught myself to speak my own language, I certainly can learn to read. But his teacher is using the Dick and Jane reading program. And he's going to be taught to read by sight. And so this is what he's taught to read in the first grade by his teacher, by sight. Dick, look, Jane. Look, look. See Dick. See, see. Oh, see. See Dick. Oh, see Dick. Oh, oh, oh. Funny, funny Dick. This little youngster sits there and he says to himself, gee, either I'm crazy or she's crazy. And what's this? Oh, oh, look, look, see, see. That's not the way people talk. This is ridiculous. This school's a weird place. But Mother has told me to behave myself, to do the best I can, and I certainly will try. But at the end of the year, he's not doing well at all. You see, he's one of the one-third identified by Dr. Orton as those who have problems learning to read this way. Why? Well, he may have great auditory and verbal skills, but his visual skills are not so hot. You see, he doesn't have a photographic memory. So he's going to have problems. And at the end of the year, he's having terrible problems. And Mother is called to school and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a reading problem. We shall have to keep him back a year. And so here's Johnny, who felt so intelligent in September. By June, he's saying to himself, gee, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I'm dumb. And then at the end of the second year, things don't improve. As a matter of fact, they get worse. And Mother is called to school again and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a learning disability. Johnny is dyslexic. We shall have to put him in special education. And so now Mother is thinking, my God, if I give him birth to a defective child, what's wrong with Johnny? And so he's taken to doctors and psychiatrists and, you know, and he's tested and retested, and they're all trying to know what's wrong with Johnny. Maybe it's minimal brain damage, minimal brain dysfunction, neurological impairment, attention deficit syndrome. That must be it, attention deficit syndrome. Or, you know, they're trying to find what's wrong with him, and then they think, oh no, maybe it's an allergy. Maybe he's eating too many Twinkies, drinking too much Pepsi-Cola. They're all concerned with what's wrong with Johnny, not what's wrong with the way they're teaching in the schools, but what's wrong with Johnny. And by now, Johnny is going around saying, I'm stupid, I can't learn, I'm dyslexic. He's already resigned himself to his new status, you see. And Mother, of course, is frantic, and she doesn't know what to do, so she just goes along with the educators who put this poor youngster in special ed. And after a year in special ed, what do you think happens? He becomes a behavioral problem. Johnny is now swinging from the rafters. You see, in addition to being taught to read by this ridiculous method, he's been told that he's a little animal, a product of evolution, and he's been taken to the zoo to see his cousins, the monkeys, and to say hello to his uncle, the gorilla. And he sees them swinging from the bars, and he said to himself, I can swing too. So there he goes swinging. And so Mother is called to school again, after being informed that her son is a little monster. And so, Mrs. Jones, if Johnny is to remain in school, he will have to take medication. And so back to the psychiatrist they go, and of course they recommend their favorite behavioral modification drug known as Ritalin. And in a very short time, our little Johnny is reduced to a little zombie in the classroom, destined to a life as a functional illiterate. Now that scenario is going on all over America, in every school district, in every state. It's now the biggest business in America. Creating functional illiteracy, creating special education, which is now funded by the federal government by the billions, and now drugging the kids. You see, this method works wonders. You see, what this method of teaching does is stop the learning process. As I said, this child comes to school with tremendous learning energy, language learning energy, and what this method of teaching does is it brings that whole process to a screeching halt. So the child is there with all this learning energy that's in the brain that has no outlet, and so it comes out in physical form. He becomes hyperactive. He becomes a victim of attention deficit syndrome. Well, now they've got to have a way to deal with these kids who can't sit still. So what do? They now drug them. I tell you, the schools have got it down to a science. They know how to do it. They are deceiving millions of parents, destroying the minds of millions of children. See, what's happening to that child is that the educators, the teachers, are performing a non-surgical prefrontal lobotomy on the kids. See, they're removing the brain. Why? Well, to behavioral psychologists, the brain is not very important. It gets in the way of things. They only are concerned about behavior. And so they got to get rid of the brain. That's why some of these kids come out of school and you call them airheads. You heard of airhead? Nothing up there. As a matter of fact, what happens to many of these kids is they go into school having learned to read, having been taught by their parents at home, and in a year's time they can no longer read. I've had that told to me by parents. They teach their child to read at home before going to school, and a year of this look-say stuff, and the child can't read anymore, and he regresses. His language no longer develops, his speech no longer develops, and all you have to do is listen to today's young adults to know what has been done to their speech. They can't even speak anymore. And now we're actually graduating youngsters from American schools with no employable skills. We're creating a new underclass. A new underclass, particularly in the inner cities, among the blacks and the Hispanics. These are youngsters, all of whom have spent 8 to 12 years in school and have emerged at the end of the process with no employable skills. They know nothing. They can't read, they can't write, they can't add, they can't think, they can't even speak their own language anymore. Can you imagine spending 12 years in school and coming out knowing nothing? That's quite an achievement, isn't it? You see, our schools are now so efficient in destroying young people that they can actually do it and get away with it and blame it on the kids and then blame it on you. Oh, it's the parents' fault. It's the taxpayers. You're not willing to spend enough money, you see. Oh, they'll blame you all the time. Matter of fact, in the last few weeks, that's all we've heard of, these sob stories about how, how miserly the Reagan administration has been. Well, I did a newsletter, one of my newsletters on how the federal government squanders billions on education. The U.S. government started funding public education in 1965 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. They had, Chapter 1, or Title 1 of that act was Education of Disadvantaged Children. They said, well, we've got to take these poor kids from the ghettos and give them an extra push. And so they created Title 1. Do you know how much money has been spent on Title I? Between 1966 and 1986, $49 billion, $745 million. That's just one program. And what has been the result? We have worse problems today than ever. You mean that isn't enough money? That isn't enough money to give these kids an education? 49 billion, almost 50 billion. By now it's more. If you add the figures for 1987 and 88, it goes over $50 billion. That's just one program. You see how they're fooling us. And of course, it's so political now that the NEA virtually controls many state legislatures. They get everything they want. There are more teachers now in many state legislatures than lawyers. They're involved in the municipal elections, school board elections, state legislative elections, presidential elections, congressional elections. The NEA and its affiliates collect $500 million a year in dues, most of which goes for political activity. So you're talking of a system that is now so efficient and so powerful. How can we fight this? How can we fight something as horrendous as this? How can we save these little Johnnies from this misery, from being destroyed? How can we do it? Well, I'll tell you the truth. Apart from going around the country and speaking and trying to wake people up, the NEA isn't very worried about me. You see, it's very hard for me to get on the national networks or to get time on television, national television, or in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. You know why? Because what I'm telling you is too unbelievable. There's a credibility problem. See, the businessmen know that there's something wrong in American education. For example, David Kearns, the president of Xerox Corporation, recently denounced the schools as a failed monopoly with a 50% defect rate. And then he said businesses must hire workers who can't read, write, or count, and then spend $25 billion a year to train them. Well, now when you go to Mr. Kearns and you try to convince him why this is happening and why the reform hasn't amounted to beans, and you know we've had all of this reform now since the Nation at Risk in 1983 reform. Here it is 1988, and they're all bemoaning. What happened to the reform? Where's the improvement? And the neighboring state here of Washington, the verbal SAT scores have declined from 1980 to 87, declined 21 points. Last year alone, the verbal score declined 6 points. And that's supposed to be a great liberal progressive state where, you know, they fund education. Incidentally, the educators have warned us of worse things to come. See, they know that things are going to get worse, so they're preparing us. They held a meeting on June 1st in Washington last year, at the end of which they put out an announcement of academic disaster ahead. I happened to be in Tucson, Arizona on June 2nd, and that story made the front page headline of the Tucson Citizen. I don't know if it made headlines in any other newspaper in America, but this is what it said. It said, young failures call peril to U.S., unproductive children term drain on society. Washington, as many as 1/3 of the nation's 40 million school-aged children are at serious risk of failing in school and society, which would create massive, urgent problems for the nation, leaders of 11 education groups warned yesterday. Their coalition, known as the Forum of Educational Organization Leaders, said this potentially huge number of unproductive citizens will drain the economy in welfare and social service costs and seriously hamper the nation's ability to compete internationally. Well, they're telling us, we're going to give you lots more failure. It's not interesting. You know, supposing the managers, the directors of the General Motors Corporation went before their stockholders and told them, we plan to produce massive numbers of lemons in the years ahead. What do you think the stockholders would do to the management? They'd get rid of them, wouldn't they? But here the educational leaders of America are telling us that they intend that they're going to produce, that we must expect massive numbers of academic lemons in the years ahead, and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, why is this going to happen? Well, it's either of two reasons. Either they are totally incompetent and cannot produce academic excellence, or they have no intention of producing academic excellence. It has to be one or the other. Now, if they're incompetent and can't produce it, shouldn't they say, look guys, we've tried very hard, we can't do it, we're going to step down and let somebody else do it? No. They're saying we can't do it, but we intend to stay in place. But if they do not intend to produce academic excellence, then they are deceiving and defrauding the public, and they should be put in jail. So that's what they've done to the great nation of America. We're now the laughing stock of the world. This great nation is spending all this money on education, and we have children coming out unable to read and write. And it's all the result of a political decision made by the educators as far back as 1898. You have to understand that whole political picture. Education is completely politicized in America today. They have no intention of producing anything but that socialist utopia that they still believe in. If you don't think the humanists believe in that socialist utopia, you haven't read many humanist publications. They still believe in this nonsense. They still believe that they can even produce it. Of course, now they're going to do it with the help of the Soviet Union. We're going to get that wonderful merger. You've heard of the Soviet-American education. So that's what we're up against. Now, how do you deal with this? How do we conservatives, how do Christians deal with such an incredible situation? Well, you've got to do the same kind of analysis that Dewey did. Dewey analyzed his enemy, and we have to analyze our enemies. Now, I have analyzed the enemy, and there are two things I have learned so far. First of all, most Americans are fed up with public education. So that's something that's on our, something on our side. The public educators, the educational leaders, the NEA, has very little support. In other words, the organized profession has very little support or sympathy from the public. This I know from just my experience in being on talk shows, radio talk shows. I mean, most of the callers, agree with me 100%. Rarely does anyone defend the NEA. It's usually an NEA person who defends the NEA. And that's because a lot of people in the media have children. They want their kids to be educated. So that's the weakest link in this whole conspiracy to turn America into a socialist society. The weakest link is the public disillusionment with government education. That's something we must explore. The second thing is that there's a growing movement of resistance on the part of Christian parents, particularly Christian parents. There are others as well, but certainly Christian parents have created the strongest resistance against this movement. They are removing their children from the public schools. It is true that many Christians think, well, we've got to stay in the public schools and try to reform them and take them over. Forget it. You can't do it. You can't do it with the graduate schools of education controlled by these behavioral psychologists and these professors of education with their millions of dollars in foundation money, in federal grants, in NEA dues. You can't do it. We just don't have the resources. So the first thing we must do is save our own children. And that means removing them from the public schools and putting them in Christian schools or private schools or in homeschools. That has to be done. And those movements are all growing. The homeschool movement is growing leaps and bounds. It's the fastest growing educational phenomenon in the United States, and it is absolutely breathtaking to see what's happening there. Now, all over the country they're having homeschooling conventions and book fairs and all kinds of things. Now, of course, the NEA and the organized profession is trying to stop all of this. And they're trying to get the legislature to pass all sorts of restrictive laws, but we've got to fight. And I have been instrumental in founding a new organization called Parents for Unalienable Rights in Education. Now, the reason why I've created this organization is because we must mobilize parents, homeschooling parents, to fight the state, the bureaucrats, the educational professionals. Because they're fighting us, they have plans for us, we have got to assert parental rights. You see, if we want to defend our Constitution, And that's what this organization is all about, defending the Constitution. You've got to defend the idea of parental rights. Who owns the children? Parents or the state? The state believes otherwise. John Dewey believed otherwise. He believed that he could do anything with your children he wanted. And that's the way the humanists believe today. They can take your children and turn them into, as you've seen, zombies if they want to. That's how they feel about it. And so parents must begin a movement to take back their children, take back their rights, assert their unalienable rights. You see, the Bible commands parents to take control of their children's education, to educate their children. That's a biblical command. And anything that God commands, you don't need permission from the state to do. So we have a fight on our hands, but I can tell you we're going to have a wonderful time in this fight. As a matter of fact, in our organization, which uses the acronym PURE, we're going to use the cherry pie as our symbol. See, and we're creating National Home Education Week, the first week of May of every year. And we will have our families visit the state legislators and give them cherry pies every year so that they will know what kind of an organization we are and what parents are about and what children are about. So we've got a tremendous fight on our hands, but we're going to do it in a very joyous way. Yes, some people may have to go to jail. Nobody wants to go to jail, but we'll go to jail if we have to. Our vice president, our vice chairman is Sharon Pangolin. She and her husband spent 132 days in jail in Alabama for the so-called crime of homeschooling. You see, we've got to realize that there's a price to be paid for our freedom. You see, 200 years ago, the Founding Fathers paid a tremendous price. They went through considerable sacrifice and inconvenience to give us this free country. You know, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, King George had not given their independence in a civil platter. They went through 6 long years of war, bloodshed, suffering, destruction, in order to fulfill that declaration. Now, we're that generation now that's on the battle line. You see, if we don't want to be the last generation to enjoy these freedoms, we're going to have to stand up and fight. We have no choice. History has not given us a choice. History has told us that we're on that line. If we let the state take the children from us and take parental rights, we will have lost. Because that's the difference between a free society and a dictatorship, is who owns the children. Whose children are they? And if you want your children to enjoy the benefits, the heritage of freedom that the Founding Fathers bequeathed us, then you're going to have to make sacrifices and go through considerable inconvenience. And I'm sure you know that, or otherwise you wouldn't be here tonight. You're that kind of people. You're the kind of people that are going to stand in the way of the humanists from steamrolling over this country. So I want to commend you and your organization for what you're doing, for what you've stood for all these years. And I know that you're going to be with us in this fight in the years ahead, and we're going to win. Because what God commands us to do, we're going to do, and we're going to come out victorious. Thank you very much.
To answer questions, since the hour has gotten rather late, I don't know about you, but I feel like I've been to an entire semester here in one evening. It is such a wealth of information, and I know that many of us needed to have the background information he gave to bring us to the point that he did. But let us say this way, if some of you have other commitments and you do need to go, I know that Erdine Schwan had wanted to invite you to a video showing of America, You're Too Young to Die. The tape we've talked about, a videotape, and she has it set up in her room. If some of you want to slip off and see her, that you might need to start that. I know that some of you will have some questions, but if the others have other places to go, why please feel free to go ahead. It will not bother Dr. Blumenfeld, but he is happy to take questions at this time.
Yes, ma'am.
You're quite familiar with the McGuffey readers, and I keep reading advertisements in the conservative periodicals. I have a set myself for it. And are they receiving wide distribution? Do you know if any private schools are using them?
Oh, yes, yeah. A lot of Christian schools are using McGuffey readers, a lot of homeschoolers. They're making quite a comeback. They're wonderful books, wonderful books.
Yes, they teach moral values.
That's right. They teach moral values, and that's very important. Yes, ma'am.
How does your phonics reading work on someone, say, at 18 years old and can't read, poor reader, if they started over with that and they have fairly good success?
Yes, if they're an 18-year-old who is a poor reader who has been taught by look say, then what I do, and I've been training youngsters, as a matter of fact, I developed my Alpha Phonics book for the purpose of retraining look say readers into phonetic readers. And so what I do is first I teach them, I have them go through the entire alphabetic system in the Alpha Phonics book. Now once they've gained that phonetic knowledge, then we must apply it. And that means breaking all the old habits that they've acquired over the years. And as I said, you have to have them read aloud next to you in your tutoring sessions, and then you've got to stop them whenever they make an error. For example, if they leave out a word, or if they put in a word, you've got to stop them and make them aware of the errors they are making. You see, most of the time they're not aware of the errors they make. So you have to stop them and make sure they become aware of their errors. Then they've got to apply their phonetic knowledge to the words they don't know. For example, they come across a new big word, you break it up into syllables and you have them sound out the syllables, and you can put these words into a blank notebook so that they accumulate a vocabulary list, and then you go over this vocabulary list frequently so that they become familiar with these words, because suddenly they will be reading words that they never saw before, never heard before, and before you can know the meaning of a word, you want to be able to say it or hear it. So that's important. And it can take some time depending on how often you tutor, whether it's a half hour a day or an hour a week. It took me a couple of years to change a sight reader into a phonetic reader.
What about their self-esteem and how do you handle it? You know, how do you feel about themselves while they're doing it?
Well, motivation is very important. There are some kids who have been so badly damaged that just the sight of words, turns them off. And so you've got to prove that they can learn very well, and since my book is very systematic and very simple, they usually see how different it is from what they've had before, and it usually works. But I must say I had one youngster who was very difficult, very recalcitrant, and that's because it was a real ego problem. Simply could not get by that ego of his. He would not do what I wanted him to do. He was just too, I don't know, he felt it was like an insult to him.
I taught children in the culture, and this is not as general as some people might assume from the talk. Can you emphasize and protect about service children?
Well, this is the way it works. Now, during the period when they made the switch, there were a lot of very good teachers who considered the look-say method to be total nonsense and taught what was known as bootleg phonics. In other words, they just keep on teaching. They would use the Dick and Jane books, but they would teach phonics anyway, you see. So they helped a lot of children learn to read. But I was told by a school teacher from California who was told by her professor that 1/3 of the children would not learn to read at all. A second third would become passable readers, and only 1/3 would become proficient readers. Now, the proficient reader usually was a person who had been taught at home or had a photographic memory or could figure it out for himself or herself, that sort of thing. But this method of teaching reading never really produces high literacy.
Well, I couldn't speak to that. I just feel an obligation to say that as a teacher during those years in Nebraska,
Yes.
I felt no pressure to add here to a certain method of teaching reading. The whole emphasis on did I teach reading?
Yeah. Oh yes, listen, if you're taught to teach this way at a teacher's college, there's no particular pressure. That's the way you've been taught to teach. So you're given the books and you've got them there and you've got all the materials and you teach that way. There's no particular pressure to do it. The pressure would be on the superintendents to make sure that it gets into the schools. Once the books are accepted, where the pressure is where you have a teacher who teaches phonics. And the pressure is to get a teacher to not teach phonics. For example, in Amarillo, a young teacher wanted to teach intensive phonics in a remedial program. This was just a couple of months ago. And he happened to mention that he was going to use an intensive phonics program in his remedial reading class. And he happened to mention this to some fellow teachers. That fellow teacher went to the supervisor, who then sent the teacher a letter telling him to cease and desist. Now, that's pressure coming from the other side, you see.
Well, in the school districts where I taught, there was more control by the school board. And really, we didn't feel a great deal of pressure. So I imagine there was more of a difference maybe than...
Yeah, listen, it's not uniform. We don't live in a dictatorship yet. And there was considerable variation between school districts, but I'm talking in general. You see, in general.
I just felt that I wouldn't want somebody to think that I taught people.
Oh, no, I know, sure, listen. Yes, yes, ma'am.
A lot of the proponents of homeschools and private schools are really enthusiastic about the voucher system. My question is, with the passage of the Civil Rights Restoration Act, are they going to inhibit it in their sort of curriculum, et cetera?
Well, to tell you the truth, that this is about the voucher system. I am not for the voucher system or for tuition tax credits because that would only bring the government into the private sector. I mean, our idea is to get the government out of the education business and to restore educational freedom. And if we go for vouchers and tuition tax credits, that'll only bring the government into regulating private schools, and that's the last thing we want. So I'm not for vouchers. Yes, ma'am.
Would you care to discuss the new math and how it's discussed arithmetic learning, math learning?
Yes, the new math. They had a whole program on destroying arithmetic in this country. As a matter of fact, they no longer even call it arithmetic. They call it mathematics. Remember the old arithmetic? They don't call it that. It's now math. And what they've done is they've submerged arithmetic into some bigger thing called math, and they teach set theory and all kinds of strange nonsense, which makes no sense to kids or even their parents. So they did a good job in destroying the children's ability to even, do simple arithmetic. You see, the way the progressives get what they want is by saying, oh, you don't want rote learning. Rote learning is terrible. That's reactionary. That's for only die-hard Republicans and John Birchers. Rote learning, you see. We don't want you to have to memorize tables. And so that's how they get out of it. So then they teach arithmetic in this other way, which, makes it very difficult for kids to learn. And that's why nowadays at McDonald's, you see they've got everything on the cash register there so that the kid doesn't have to use his brain. Yes, sir.
Mr. Doctor, one of the things that becomes apparent as you look at education is it's extremely labor intensive. And that, like in our own community here, we've got a $3 million override coming up, and we have one about every couple of years, it seems like. What is the progress that's been done towards using computers to teach students in the elimination of teachers in some classes, because the classes, could be standardized. And you don't need a teacher to inject their own personal feelings about a subject.
Well, you know what they say about computers? Garbage in, garbage out. So you have to know what's in the computer. Not all computer programs are, I would recommend. There's one computer program that teaches kids to read by a totally phonetic method, so that if they, the word love is spelled L-U-V. If the child spells it L-O-V-E, he's marked wrong. You see, I've seen that's such a program, an IBM program that was being used in a school. I was shocked to find that the child would be marked wrong for spelling the word right. That sort of thing. So just having computers is not enough. And whether or not it's labor intensive or not, the reason why the schools have become so expensive is because special education is expensive. Look, say reading programs are expensive. As I explained, to teach a child to read, all you need is a little book that teaches the letters and the sounds of the letters. And then the child can read anything. But your school district is forced to buy these horrendous basal reading programs that are very expensive and don't teach, that create learning disabilities. So then you need expensive special education with all these specialists and 4 kids to a class, that sort of thing. That's where all the expense is coming in. And all these administrators and counselors. Oh, for example, now that they teach death education, we have all of this suicide. Well, now that you have suicide, you need lots of psychologists. So they got to teach more suicide. They get into sex education, they get all these pregnancies, they need counselors, and they say teach more sex education. The more teenage pregnancy you get, the more sex education you need. And then they say also you got to teach at a lower age. So now they're going to teach sex education in kindergarten. So you cannot see this thing in a simplistic way of just, labor intensive and using computers or machinery. The system is so sick. So they've institutionalized malpractice to such an extent that people don't even understand it's going on. But that's what's costing the taxpayer a bundle. It's this educational malpractice, and until you get rid of it, you're not going to be able to solve this problem.
But the point I'm trying to make is that one of the reasons that the educational system is so complex is because you have this myriad of teachers all trying to inject their own personal values and their own methods into the teaching system. Now, there are a lot of teachers that don't believe in this non-phonic way of teaching reading.
Right.
But if we standardize the thing, at least we'd have better control over it. We'd understand what it is our children are being taught.
Yeah, but you're assuming that we have the power to standardize it, that they're listening to us, that they want to change. There's nobody up there who will do it our way. Nobody. I'll give you a very good example of how they work. In the 60s, there arose a movement called Back to Basic Schools, fundamental alternative schools within the school system, because parents said, we want back to basic, we want discipline, we want a dress code. So in some districts, the school board got so sick of listening to the parents, they said, okay, we will give you your back to basic school. So they would set aside some rundown school in the district, which they had earmarked for destruction, and they'd clean it up, and they'd say, here's your back to basic school, and they'd get a few teachers who would volunteer, who wanted it, and so the kids, then they'd have a long waiting list to get into the school. They'd have a dress code, they'd have discipline, they'd teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, and that school would exist there until the parents whose children had been in that school no longer lived there anymore, or the kids had graduated or gone on, and there was no longer that pressure, and then they would reintegrate that back to basic school back into their stupid, messy, ridiculous system. So in other words, they know how to do the right thing when they are forced to do it, and in certain instances, they have been forced to do it, just to placate the parents. But they do it very reluctantly. And what I am saying is that Christians do not have the energy and the money and the time to constantly try to get these people to do what we want them to do. They're not going to do it. They will sabotage it at every level you can imagine. And so that's why I'm saying there's not much we can do with those public schools, but we can control our own schools. We can control the education of our own children. Let's take care of that. We'll offer suggestions. I mean, they can hear me. They can read my books. What do you have to do with them? Bludgeon them over the head?
You have to cut their first grade.
That's it. Exactly. And so what I'm telling Christians is, first take your kids out, and then once you've got your kids out, then remove your financial support. Now, how can you do that? Well, once your kids are no longer in the public schools, you can go to court in a class action suit and say, hey, it's unconstitutional to force Christians to support atheist education. After all, the atheists are not forced to support Christian education. Why should Christians be forced to support atheist education? And then you can begin a process of defunding. But that's the only strategy that will work. The idea that you can get them to adopt your standardized way of doing things. They've known that just as in 1955, they knew that phonics worked better than looks say. Well, how come in 1988 they still aren't teaching intensive phonics? Because they are determined to lead us into that socialist utopia. And there's nothing that will deter them from that, short of a revolution by the parents of this country. Yes, ma'am.
If federally financed daycare centers become a reality, how do you think it will affect education?
Well, they'll just perform their prefrontal lobotomies earlier on these kids, that's all. It's just going to put the kids in their hands earlier and so they can ruin them earlier. That's about it. Yes, ma'am.
You referred to Soviet American Education Treaty.
Yeah. Well, it's an agreement that was made in Geneva with Secretary Schultz and the Soviets for mutual exchange of computers, rewriting textbooks, removing anti-Soviet, anti-communist stuff from American textbooks, that sort of thing. And that's going on right now. It was financed and planned by the Carnegie Corporation. The Carnegie Foundation planned all of this. And what they want is a merger of the two education systems.
That way they're taking all of religion and whatnot out of it.
Oh yes, well that's been done for quite some time now. That's the reason why those parents in the Mozart case, Mozart versus the county of in Tennessee, Hawkins, yes, versus Hawkins. That's why they went to court, because they didn't want their children to have to read humanistic textbooks. And so the judge agreed with them and said, yes, these children ought not to be forced to read humanistic textbooks. The schools should try to accommodate Christian children by giving them alternate textbooks to read. But then the state appealed, and an appellate court reversed the case, saying, listen, if the school board wants these kids to read humanist books, they'll have to read them. The school board is entitled to say, my way or hit the highway. Isn't that interesting? Their reasoning is, you can force children to read humanistic textbooks because they don't have to believe what they're reading. Can you imagine little kids being forced to read books and being told, you don't have to believe what you're reading? On what basis are they going to be able to decide what's true and what's false? I mean, little children, how are they in a position to know what's right, what's true and what's false? In other words, they're telling us, Christians, you don't like the way we do things in the public schools, get out. Now that's about the stiffest kick in the behind Christians have gotten so far. Let's see. And I think Christians ought to take it to heart and realize that there's no future for them in public education.
Amen.
I mean, if they kick us out, what? They gave us our walking papers. Why are we begging them? Why do we want them? We don't even need those horrible public schools with their death education and sex education and AIDS education and values clarification and sensitivity training and situational ethics and multiculturalism and globalism. Who needs that? You put your child in a public school and if he manages to come out a human, you're lucky. Well, college education is a problem, but hopefully if your child has been given a good Christian education, he'll understand what he's up against in the colleges. There are some good, decent colleges in America. There's Hillsdale in Michigan. There's Grove City College in Pennsylvania. There's Pensacola Christian College in Pensacola, Florida. There's Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. So there are a number of decent colleges, but you put your child in a state university, and you know, the state university, that's humanism. That's headquarters for humanism. Yes, ma'am?
Talking about the Carnegie Endowment Foundation was given permission or part of the power to certify teachers nationally, and where that came, what the results of this.
Well, the Carnegie Foundation came out with this report on teaching that they want to turn the teaching profession into a profession. I don't know what it is now, if it's not a profession. I suppose at one time it was a profession, then it became a labor union, then they became workers, proletariats. Now they want to become professionals again. So the Carnegie Corporation says, well, what we need are master teachers who will be nationally certified. But let's face it, what does the Carnegie Corporation want? They want socialism. They want these master teachers who are going to impose this new socialist thinking on all of the teachers in America. You see, it's part of the same scheme. They're not interested. You know, when I ever read any of these reports, these reform reports, and I read as many of them as I can, they never mention anything about the way they teach reading. They never suggest or advance any change in the way they're doing things in grades 1, 2, and 3, and that's where all the damage is done. Even our good friend William Bennett, all of his recommendations were on high school, how to improve high school. Now, I met Bill Bennett at a meeting, and I said, look, the biggest problem we have in American education today is the way they teach reading. And I said, I'll be very glad to be of assistance to you should you ever need me. He hasn't called yet. I was seated next to Everett Koop, Surgeon General of the United States, at a luncheon. He was there and I was right next to him. And I had an opportunity. I said, I've got the ear of the Surgeon General. So I told him, I said, you know, Dr. Koop, that the schools are using a method of teaching reading that causes reading disability? That Dr. Orton pointed this out in 1929? That they are deliberately causing learning disabilities? Now, there's the Surgeon General. You would have thought he would have asked, is that true? Can you send me information? I'd like to have further discussions about this. You know what happened? He didn't say a word. I might have been talking about the weather. Not a word. Not a question. He probably thought, gee, that guy's an idiot. Probably some right-wing extremist. Now, of course, he's promoting condoms. They're telling the children of America, barring abstinence, a condom is your best protection against AIDS. Barring abstinence. Most kids don't even know what barring abstinence means. Barring? What does that have to do with a bar somewhere? Abstinence, what's that? Is that a new drink? It's got to do with a bar, so it must be a drink. Barring abstinence, very good. See, that's what the educators are telling American children. They're saying, oh, there's this horrible plague coming down the pipe. It may destroy us all. However, there's one thing that will really protect you. A little balloon. That's what they they're telling the kids of America. A little balloon is going to protect them from the world's greatest plague. Are you going to trust your kids to those idiots? I wouldn't trust a dog to those idiots, let alone a human child. Yes, ma'am.
Is that, you mentioned the class action suit about atheists supporting Christian schools and Christian...
Yeah, right.
Is that happening and should we...
It hasn't happened yet. I'm waiting for some Christians to get together.
Is that a real viable...
Of course it is.
Who should...
Isn't it? I mean, don't you think it's unconstitutional to force Christians to support atheist education?
Can anybody decide to do that?
Sure. Anybody. Anybody who wants to get together a group of people, get a lawyer, and get a lawyer who believes what you believe. The problem with a lot of lawyers is they don't believe anything. You see, that's the problem with our lawyers these days, is they're part of the system. So you've got to find a good Christian lawyer who understands what has to be done, you see. But go to it. I give out these suggestions, these ideas. Any further questions? Yes, sir.
Are there any statistics available on the correlation between functional illiteracy and crime in our country?
Well, there's no doubt about it that functional literacy does have an effect on delinquency because there have been studies that show the correlation. As a matter of fact, it was Justice Berger who put out the statistic that 85% of the people in jail are functionally illiterate. So that certainly contributes to their view that they can't get things through the normal way. In other words, they've got to turn to crime. Now, we know that all of these youngsters in the ghettos of America who are deeply involved in drug trafficking and crime are functionally illiterate. They're the underclass. They've come out of schools with no employable skills. Matter of fact, Berger suggested, he said, no one should be released from prison unless they've been taught to read. But who's teaching them to read? Usually the look-say teachers. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Johnny might be swinging from the rafters.
Right.
What do you do with him by the time he gets to be a junior or a senior in high school? Do you have to be a clown and a garbage can? Or do you have to just give him athletics?
Just give them athletics, yeah. That's a tough one. You see, it depends on the situation at home. It depends on the parents. It depends on the youngster, whether he's amenable to being tutored or retrained in reading. You certainly don't have to sugarcoat things. You know, one of the reasons why I don't care for Sesame Street is because it's a total insult to the youngster. They're telling the youngster, hey kid, we know that you don't want to learn. You're a little dumb buffoon anyway, so we're going to sugarcoat everything. You won't know you're learning. We'll have all sorts of drums going on around it. You won't know you're learning. You see, they insult the kid. Here are youngsters who've taught themselves to speak their own language all by themselves. They're serious learners. Kids don't need any gimmicks to teach themselves to speak their own language.